Hello students, today we're going to talk about glaze. The first thing I want you to do is to glue the handout in your sketchbook. So you should have some handouts attached to this post, and I want them glued on the same page that you are taking these notes. At the top of that page, write the title, All About Glaze. We're going to start with the question of what is glaze. So you need to make sure you know the definition. It is a type of glass which melts in a fire at a given temperature, but does not melt enough to run off the object in coats. The history of glaze is that it was discovered in 5000 BC. It was discovered by the Egyptians. They also discovered glass. It was an accident when they accidentally combined sand and salt, and they heated some ceramic pieces, and the mixture became overheated and a coating formed on the outside, and that is how they discovered glaze. Glaze and clay both contain clay and silica, just in different proportions. Will you be able to eat and drink off of your ceramic pieces? The answer is yes. As long as you have a symbol like this on the bottle somewhere, it means that it is safe for food products. And things with the knife and fork symbol means that they are non-toxic and lead-free. If you make your pieces correctly, they can go in the dishwasher, and they can also go in the microwave. So can you eat glazes while they're in their raw form? Definitely not. But the non-toxic glazes can be used after they are fired on pottery pieces. The product in the jar, if it is non-toxic, contains chemicals that are not harmful to humans when they are fired. Never eat clay or glaze, and wash your hands before eating any other things when you are done working. The only thing that is not food safe are the metallic glazes that we have in the classroom. So if you are using a metallic glaze such as palladium, saturation gold, or saturation metallic, please make sure that you only use those glazes on decorative pieces. There are a couple of vocabulary words I want you to write down, so you can pause the video here and copy these terms. So this is the definition for glaze that I want you to have written down. Glaze is a mixture of silica, alumina, flint, and flux, along with other substances that give color, usually metal oxides. Opacity is how much light passes through something, and we're going to talk about that specifically as it relates to glaze. And then fusing is when two things blend or join to form a single object. So you want your glaze to fuse to your ceramic piece. Glaze composition is flint plus flux plus clay, which is silica and alumina. You also have a colorant. Those things combined will give you glaze. Flint is what forms the glass. Clay is what makes the glaze stick to the vessel. Silica is what is shiny like glass. Alumina helps keep the glaze on the pot, just like the clay. The flux is used to lower the melting point of the higher temperature ingredients. Metal oxides are what provide color. The difference between glaze and glass is that glass stands alone and glaze must be bonded to something. Temperatures and types. We have several different types of glazes at Hernando High School. We have clear glaze, which has no color in it. We have low fire glazes, and those are fired to cone 04, 05, or 06. So when you set up your sketchbook, you actually glued a picture that looks like a thermometer into your sketchbook, and it's going to tell you what each one of those numbers stands for. Yes, ma'am?
Hey, is Brittany there?
Yes, ma'am.
She's checked out.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
We also have high fire glazes, which you fire to cone 4, 5, and 6. At Hernando High School, we have two different brands. We have Celadon Glazes by Amaco, and we also have Potter's Choice Glazes by Amaco. Those are high fire glazes, so you actually fire those to a higher temperature in the kiln, and I want you to wait until Ceramics 2 to use those glazes. We also have underglaze, which is not the same thing as glaze, and it is not shiny. These are some picture examples of the different brands and types and what they look like. The first image is of a Potter's Choice layered glaze. So on the left of that image, you see two small pieces of pottery, and those are each glazed by itself. So the picture says that it is seaweed in the first green picture, and then deep fire brick in the next picture. And then the large piece of pottery is an example of when you layer those two different colors together. So that is why I want you to wait until Ceramics 2 to do this so that you can experiment with layering when you know more about glaze. The next picture is an example of a Celadon glaze. So a Celadon glaze is going to be a translucent glaze that has color to it, but where you have high areas of relief, you will actually see the glaze break over the texture, and you will get the differences between the white areas and then areas that are lower where more glaze pools, you'll have different shades of a single color. It's actually very beautiful. The bottom two pictures are both low fire glazes, so those are available to you in Ceramics 1. The first is an example of an opalescent glaze. So think of an opal and how it is iridescent and shiny. That is how those glazes will look. And the next glaze is called Alligator Glaze sometimes it is called textured glaze. Sometimes it is called artist choice glaze. So they tend to change the name of this line every year, but it is a glaze that is going to once again break over texture just like all of these images are doing. And so anywhere that you have texture on your piece, it's going to make these really cool variations in color. And it's going to look more professional and realistic. The last image is an example of a crystal glaze. So we have some crystal text glazes, which are made for students to be able to experiment with crystal glazes. So you have little bits and pieces of glass mixed in the glaze that are different colors, and they randomly burst in the glaze, and so you get this really cool color background with these different bursts of color kind of randomly over your piece. The other type of glaze that we have a lot of is Amaco's Teacher's Palette Glaze or Teacher's Choice Glaze. So those are going to be your very straightforward colors, and what it looks like on the label is what it's going to look like when it is fired. Notice that I say what it looks like on the label is what it's going to look like when it's fired. Don't go by what it looks like in the jar, because usually glazes are going to get a little bit darker. They look chalky before they are fired, and sometimes certain colors look nothing like they will be when they turn out in the kiln. So always read the label to figure out what color it actually is. These are examples of the different Potter's Choice glazes. We have a lot of those, and that will be for you to use in Ceramics 2. They are really fun to be able to layer, and they look more like professional Potter's glazes. That's why they're called Potter's Choice. The next thing I want you to write down is finishes. So the finish of the glaze is how the actual surface of your pottery will look after it is fired. And we have broken this down into 4 different categories for you. So you have glossy glazes, which are very shiny and reflective. You have satin glazes, which are about the finish of an eggshell, if you think about an actual egg, in between shiny and matte. Next, you have matte or dull glazes. So it is the opposite of gloss. It has barely any reflection or shine. Think about the way a stick of butter would look. And the picture on the bottom left of this slide with the 2 birds, that is actually an example of that matte glaze, or the butter glaze is the, kind of like colloquial term for it. And then the other picture is an example of a glossy glaze. So look at where the highlights are shining from where the light reflected off of it. And then you have flat glazes, which are a dead matte that is very dull. The surface is not reflective, and the only thing that is going to be absolutely flat is those underglazes that are not actually glaze. They're actually just slip with color added to them. So it's actually like you're layering colored clay on top of your piece, but it's very easy to control because it's in liquid form. We have the different levels of opacity. So if you will write these down in your sketchbook for your notes, O is for opaque. So sometimes on the bottle, you'll see the letter O to let you know that the glaze is opaque. That means it is solid and colors or, the color of the clay underneath will not show through. You have semi-opaque, so it is light underglaze colors, will not show through, but dark colors will just be muted. Then you have semi-transparent, or sometimes you see ST on the bottle, and that means that the glaze underneath is identifiable, but the tone is changed by the top glaze. Think about those Celadon glazes that we saw in the picture earlier. Then you have transparent glazes, or sometimes you'll just see T on the bottle, which means that the color underneath is only slightly tinted by the overlying glaze. So a lighter color Celadon, like light green, would just be transparent. Then we actually have glaze that is completely clear, and that is what you're going to use on your plate. So while you're spending all this time on your design, keep in mind that you will just put a clear coat of glaze to protect your design after you are finished. Why do we have so many different glazes? Because I would like you to be able to experiment with achieving different effects in the high school classroom. On one piece, you may want a flat color. On another, you might want an artistic finish. We also buy whatever brand has the colors we want and is the best value. So sometimes we buy different brands, or sometimes the companies that we order from through the school carries different things. So there are pros and cons to each. Low fire glaze is very predictable, but it shows brushstrokes. High fire glaze is more professional looking, but it is more likely to run off the pot if you apply it too thickly. Glazing for success. How to make sure that your work stays beautiful. So what are some things that you can look at? Think about the thickness of your glaze. If you make the glaze too thick, it will crack as it dries and flake off of your pottery. If you make it too thin, the color will be inconsistent and it may run off of your pot. How many coats do you put on your piece? 2 to 3 coats, usually 3. Just tell yourself to always put 3 coats of glaze. If you are using a very dark color, sometimes 2 coats are enough, but just to be on the safe side, go ahead and put 3 coats. If you are using a glaze that is a little bit thin, sometimes you need to put a 4th coat, but that is rare. So just tell yourself that you need to do 3 coats of glaze every single time. So while my piece is drying, I'm going to talk to you about the different types of glazes that we have available. Glazes come in many different colors and types. For this piece, or for this glaze right here, the name of it is birthday suit. So a lot of times they come up with clever names for the glaze. And so you can either think about what that might mean. If it's called birthday suit, it's talking about being in your birthday suit. So it's the color of peach or skin. And if it comes in a bottle like this, then you're probably going to have to pour it out into a jar to be able to use it. The next type of glaze that I have is called an opalescent glaze. And so what that means is it's actually going to be iridescent and shiny after it's fired. But while you're painting with it, it's just going to look white because the name of the color is transparent pearl. So the difference between glaze and paint is that glaze will actually transform in the kiln to look different than it does when you're painting it on. While you're working with it, you want it to be the consistency of, think of pancake batter or cake batter. And so you want it to be thick, but you don't want it to be too watery. And you don't want it to be so thick that you're really struggling to get smooth brush strokes. The next type of glaze that I have is a matte liquid glaze. So you always want to look to see if it says that it's going to be matte or gloss. A matte glaze is going to look kind of like butter, and a gloss glaze is going to look shiny like glass. This next glaze is called a textured alligator glaze. And what that means is that if you have texture on your piece, it's actually going to have 2 different colors because the glaze will, the word is break over the texture. and reveal two different chemical compounds. So this glaze right here is actually going to turn a green and a brown, depending on the texture. This next type of glaze is called a crystal tex, or a crystal glaze for short. So this glaze will actually have little tiny pieces of glass in it. So when you're trying to use it, you'll see these little pieces of colored glass, and those pieces will melt and burst in the kiln, creating some really interesting effects. If all of that seems a little bit too much for you, then you want to stick with the teacher's palette glaze. These are actually formulated for elementary students, so what you see on the label is exactly how it's going to come out, give or take. So this glaze is called Robin's Egg, so think of Robin's Egg blue, and the color that's right here on the label, that's really close to how the color is going to come out. Now, unlike acrylic paint, you don't want to look inside the jar and decide that it's going to look exactly like what it looks like in the jar, because it is going to undergo a chemical change in the kiln. You really want to go with what the label says it's going to look like, or what the picture of the finished product looks like. And I will show you how to look up online the finished product of the glaze. You just have to go to Google and search the brand name and the name of the color, and then you can actually see images that will show you pretty closely what the glaze will turn out to look like. Now, glaze is going through fire, so sometimes you have a little bit of color variation. Maybe it comes out a little bit darker or a little bit lighter than ideally it's supposed to come out. And that is completely normal, so you just have to kind of leave a little bit up to chance. You don't have as much control in ceramics, which a lot of times can be fun, but sometimes it's frustrating if you're trying to be super exact. So I encourage you to be a little bit more experimental and loose with your ceramics pieces. Another thing that we have in the shop is high fire glazes, but I will talk to you about those in ceramics too. Hello, Ceramics 2 students. Today, I'm going to talk to you about high fire glazes. So in Ceramics 1, you are using low fire glazes, and those are glazes that only get up to about 2,000 degrees. For glazes that are high fire glazes, I have to fire to cone 6, and that does two things. That actually makes the clay vitrify more or harden more, so you get stronger pieces of pottery. And you're also going to get to use more sophisticated colors and color combinations. So your work will look more professional when you use high fire glazes. It will also be more durable.